You know, when the history books write about the Great Galactic Trade Agreement of 2387, they'll probably focus on the economic implications, the stellar cartography rights, or maybe even the thrilling details of interspecies commerce regulations. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. What they won't mention, because apparently historians have no sense of irony, is that the entire future of human-alien relations nearly collapsed because 3 furry toddlers refused to eat their vegetables. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? The luxury space station Harmony's Edge hung in the void like a glittering jewel, all chrome and crystalline spires that caught starlight and threw it back in rainbow cascades. It was the kind of place where diplomats came to hammer out the universe's most delicate negotiations, where every surface gleamed with the polish of importance, and where, if you knew where to look, you could find a decent cup of coffee for the low, low price of your firstborn child's college fund. Captain Carroll stood at the observation deck's massive viewport, watching shuttles dock with the practiced precision of cosmic ballet dancers. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes that had seen too much of the galaxy's nonsense, auburn hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and the kind of posture that screamed, "I've dealt with your species' particular brand of crazy before, and I'm not impressed. Remind me again why I left pediatric nursing for this job?" she muttered to herself, then immediately answered her own question. Oh, right, because screaming alien diplomats pay better than screaming human children. Marginally. Her comm unit chirped with the enthusiasm of a mechanical bird that had consumed far too much caffeine. "Captain Carroll, please report to Conference Room Alpha 9 immediately. We have a situation." Carroll's eyebrow arched with the precision of someone who'd perfected the art of skeptical facial expressions. In her experience, when Station Command used the word situation with that particular tone of barely controlled panic, it usually meant one of 3 things. Someone had started a war, someone was about to start a war, or someone had accidentally insulted another species' reproductive organs in their native language. "On my way," she replied, already moving toward the turbo lift. With the efficient stride of someone who'd learned that in space, dawdling was often the difference between successful diplomacy and becoming a very pretty cloud of superheated plasma. The turbo lift whisked her through the station's gleaming corridors at a speed that would have made her stomach protest if she hadn't spent the last decade getting used to the galaxy's apparent obsession with unnecessarily fast transportation. The doors opened with a soft hiss that sounded suspiciously like a mechanical sigh of resignation. Conference Room Alpha 9 was in chaos. And when we say chaos, we don't mean the pleasant sort of chaos you might find at a children's birthday party or a particularly enthusiastic scientific conference. This was the kind of chaos that made seasoned diplomats question their career choices and reach for the emergency chocolate stash they kept hidden in their desk drawers for occasions exactly like this. The room itself was a testament to interspecies cooperation. Curved walls that accommodated various alien physiologies, environmental controls that could adjust atmosphere, gravity, and lighting faster than you could say cultural sensitivity, and furniture that transformed to suit anything from a crystalline luminar to a gas-based nebuloid. At the moment, however, all that careful engineering was being put to the test by the most diplomatically challenging creatures in the known galaxy. The Velani delegation occupied the far end of the room like living statues, carved from golden marble and bad attitudes. Ambassador Hector, their leader, was a sight to behold. Nearly 3 meters of dignified alien authority, with a leonine face that managed to convey both regal nobility and the kind of barely controlled frustration that suggested someone was about to get their diplomatic credentials revoked. His mane, a cascade of bronze and copper filaments that caught the room's lights like spun metal, bristled with an agitation that needed no translation. But it wasn't Hector who was causing the problem. No, the source of the current diplomatic crisis sat in the center of the room. 3 Velani cubs, each about the size of a human 8-year-old, each possessed of the kind of stubborn determination that could make seasoned negotiators weep into their morning stimulants. They were undeniably adorable, with oversized eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief in equal measure, and fur that shifted color with their moods like living mood rings with attitude problems. At the moment, their fur was a deep, sullen purple, the Velani equivalent of a child crossing their arms and declaring that they would rather die than eat their broccoli. The situation, Station Commander Webb explained to Carol in the tone of a man who'd already accepted that his career was probably over, is that the cubs haven't eaten in 36 hours. Carol surveyed the scene with the clinical eye of someone who'd spent years dealing with difficult patients. Around the cubs, the remnants of what must have been a dozen different feeding attempts lay scattered like the aftermath of a particularly violent food fight. Velani nutrition packets torn open and ignored, crystalline energy wafers that sparkled with untouched perfection, Zephyrian protein cubes that still hummed with their species' particular brand of molecular enthusiasm. "Let me guess," Carol said, her voice carrying the dry tone of someone who'd seen this particular drama played out countless times, just usually with smaller stakes and fewer intergalactic implications. Traditional Velani feeding protocols aren't working. Hector's response was a low rumble that managed to convey both paternal concern and the kind of wounded pride that could destabilize entire star systems. "The cubs honor us with their presence as a gesture of cultural exchange. They should consume sustenance with the dignity befitting their lineage." Translation, Carol thought. The kids are being kids, and nobody knows what to do about it. "How long," she asked, "before this becomes a medical emergency?" Velani cubs can survive without food for approximately 60 hours before experiencing permanent developmental damage, Webb replied, consulting his datapad with the enthusiasm of a man reading his own obituary. "After that, we're looking at a diplomatic incident that makes the Proxima Centauri coffee shortage look like a minor cultural misunderstanding." Carol did the math quickly. 24 hours. They had 24 hours to solve a problem that had apparently stumped some of the galaxy's finest minds. She looked at the cubs again, noting the way they huddled together, the way their eyes tracked every movement in the room with the hypervigilance of prey animals in unfamiliar territory. Their fur patterns shifted constantly, not just the angry purple of their current mood, but subtle undertones that spoke of confusion, fear, and a longing that tugged at something deep in Carol's chest. "Has anyone," she asked, "tried simply asking them what they want?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either brilliant revelations or spectacular explosions. In this case, it was the silence of highly educated individuals realizing they'd all overlooked something embarrassingly obvious. Hector's mane bristled further. The cubs do not yet possess the linguistic sophistication required for complex dietary negotiations. They communicate primarily through pheromonal emissions and chromatic displays. "Right," Carol said, settling into the mental space she'd occupied countless times before, when dealing with scared, stubborn children who spoke a language adults had forgotten how to understand. So, they're telling you exactly what they need, and everyone's too busy being diplomatic to listen. She moved closer to the cubs, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from several delegates who clearly thought she was about to commit some sort of interspecies faux pas. The smallest cub, a little female with particularly expressive eyes, watched Carol approach with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was being evaluated according to criteria no adult would ever fully understand. The cub's fur shifted from purple to a pale, uncertain yellow. "Hello there," Carol said softly, settling into a crouch that brought her down to the cub's eye level. "You're scared, aren't you? New place, new smells, new people. Nothing feels quite right." The yellow in the cub's fur deepened, and for just a moment, Carol could have sworn she saw a flicker of recognition in those large, intelligent eyes. "Captain Carol," Hector rumbled, "while we appreciate your enthusiasm, perhaps it would be better to allow those with expertise in Velani, child psychology, to—" "With respect, Ambassador," Carol interrupted, "your experts have had 36 hours to figure this out. Maybe it's time to try something different." She turned back to the cubs, her mind already shifting into the mode that had made her one of the best pediatric nurses in the sector, before politics and wanderlust had lured her into the diplomatically hazardous world of interspecies relations. Because here's the thing about children. Regardless of species, regardless of the number of limbs or the color of their fur or the complexity of their communication systems, they all wanted the same basic things: to feel safe, to feel understood, and to feel like the adults around them actually gave a damn about their well-being. And as Carol looked at three scared, homesick alien children surrounded by a room full of adults who were more concerned about trade agreements than comfort, she realized that maybe, just maybe, the solution to this particular diplomatic crisis wasn't going to be found in any protocol manual. It was going to require something much more dangerous: common sense. The smallest cub tilted her head, studying Carol with the kind of intense curiosity that suggested the real negotiations were just beginning. Now, if you've ever watched a group of highly intelligent species attempt to solve a problem using their own cultural frameworks, while completely ignoring the obvious solutions staring them in the face, you'll understand what happened next. It was like watching a committee of engineers try to fix a leaky faucet with quantum mechanics and advanced theoretical physics, while the plumber in the corner quietly suggests they might want to try turning the handle. Carol stepped back from the cubs, giving them space, while her mind catalogued everything she'd observed. But before she could voice her preliminary assessment, the cavalry arrived. And by cavalry, we mean a parade of well-meaning alien specialists who were about to demonstrate exactly why sometimes intelligence and wisdom were two completely different things. First through the door came Zizak, the Zephyrian delegate, moving with the peculiar grace of a species that had evolved from something resembling a cross between a praying mantis and a particularly ambitious hummingbird. Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy for their expertise in biochemical communication. They could detect and produce pheromones that would make a perfumer weep with envy. "The solution is obvious," Zach announced, their voice carrying the musical tones that made all Zephyrian speech sound like wind chimes having a philosophical discussion. "The cubs are experiencing nutritional confusion due to insufficient pheromonal guidance. I shall rectify this immediately." Zach's thorax began to vibrate, and the air around them shimmered with a cocktail of chemical signals designed to trigger appetite, comfort, and general well-being in young mammals. It was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of biochemical engineering, a pheromonal symphony that should have had the cubs purring and reaching for their food within minutes. Instead, the cubs took one collective sniff of Zach's molecular masterpiece and promptly turned an alarming shade of green. The smallest cub made a sound that needed no translation across species barriers. It was the universal noise of someone who was about to lose what little they had in their stomach. "Fascinating," Zizak muttered, their antennae twitching with scientific confusion. "Perhaps the dosage requires adjustment." "Perhaps," Carol suggested, with the diplomatic tact of someone who'd learned to phrase, "That's a terrible idea," in 17 different languages, "young Velani have different biochemical responses than you anticipated." Before Zach could respond, Quill glided into the room with the serene confidence of a species that had solved most problems through harmonic resonance. The Luminar were crystalline beings who communicated through light and sound frequencies, and they had a well-deserved reputation for being able to soothe any creature through the judicious application of the right vibrational patterns. "The issue is clearly one of harmonic discord," Quill announced, his crystalline structure beginning to glow with the soft, warm light that Luminar used for healing and comfort. "Young beings respond to specific frequency patterns that promote digestive harmony. Observe." What followed was perhaps the most beautiful attempt at problem-solving in the history of interspecies relations. Quill's form began to resonate with a complex pattern of light and sound that seemed to fill the room with warmth and peace. It was like being wrapped in a musical hug composed of starlight and serenity. The cubs stared at Quill with the kind of polite attention that children reserve for adults who are clearly trying very hard to help, but are missing the point entirely. Then the smallest cub opened her mouth and produced a sound that could only be described as the Velani equivalent of a raspberry, a dismissive little trill that somehow managed to convey both amusement and complete disinterest. Her siblings joined in, creating a chorus of juvenile disapproval that would have been adorable if it weren't threatening to derail galactic peace. "Perhaps," Quill said, his glow dimming slightly, "the frequency requires modification." Carol watched this parade of good intentions with the growing certainty that she was witnessing a perfect example of what happened when intelligence met the brick wall of practical reality. Each species was approaching the problem through the lens of their own evolutionary advantages: biochemical manipulation, harmonic resonance, psychological profiling, all of which were undoubtedly effective in their proper contexts, none of which were addressing the actual problem. "Has anyone," Carol said, cutting through the increasingly frantic discussions between the various specialists, "considered that maybe they're just homesick?" The room fell silent with the kind of sudden quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or someone getting thrown out an airlock. Hector's mane bristled with what Carol was beginning to recognize as his default response to any suggestion that implied Velani child-rearing might benefit from outside perspective. "The cubs," he rumbled with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly slow AI, "are accompanied by their primary caregivers and provided with optimal nutritional resources. There is no logical reason for them to experience what you term homesickness." Carol looked at the three small figures huddled together in the center of the room, their fur now cycling through a rainbow of emotional confusion, and felt something twist in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd experienced countless times in pediatric wards, when well-meaning adults couldn't understand why a child was crying despite having all their logical needs met. "Ambassador," she said, "may I share something from my previous career?" Hector's expression suggested he'd rather she didn't, but diplomatic protocol required at least the appearance of listening to allied species perspectives. "I used to work with human children," Carol continued, In medical settings, scared kids, hurt kids, kids who were away from home for the first time. And you know what I learned? Logic doesn't mean much to a frightened child. They don't care if they're getting optimal nutrition or perfect medical care. They want their favorite blanket, their bedtime story, the specific way their parent tucked them in at night. She gestured toward the cubs. Look at them. Really look. They're not just refusing food. They're refusing everything unfamiliar. The question isn't what's nutritionally optimal for them. The question is, what makes them feel safe enough to eat? Preposterous, snorted Ambassador Thranks, a Cortillian whose species had elevated logical thinking to an art form. Emotional considerations are secondary to biological imperatives. A hungry organism will eat when presented with appropriate sustenance. Will they? Carol asked. Because I'm looking at 3 hungry organisms who've been presented with appropriate sustenance for 36 hours, and they're still not eating. The silence that followed was broken by the smallest cub, who made a soft, mournful sound that needed no translation. It was the sound of a child calling for their parent, for home, for anything familiar in a world that had suddenly become large and strange and frightening. Carol felt her heart clench. Without thinking, she moved toward the cubs again, this time settling cross-legged on the floor, a position that brought her down to their level and made her seem less imposing. The movement was automatic, born of years of experience with scared children who needed comfort more than medicine. "Hey there, little one," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle tone she'd perfected during countless nights in pediatric wards. "I know everything feels wrong right now. New place, new smells, grown-ups talking too loud about things you don't understand." The smallest cub's fur shifted to a pale, uncertain yellow as she studied Carol with those enormous eyes. For a moment, the room held its collective breath. Then, Carol did something that made every diplomatic protocol officer in the sector break out in a cold sweat. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped nutrition bar, the kind of simple, uncomplicated food that humans had been eating for centuries. "You know what?" she said conversationally, unwrapping the bar with deliberate casualness. "I'm a little hungry, too. Mind if I sit here and eat with you?" She took a small bite of the nutrition bar, chewing thoughtfully while maintaining gentle eye contact with the cubs. It was a technique she'd used countless times with children who'd forgotten how to eat, who'd become so overwhelmed by their circumstances that even basic functions became impossible. Sometimes, all it took was someone to show them that eating was still safe, still normal, still something that could be done without fear. The cubs watched her with fascination, their fur colors shifting through a spectrum of curiosity and cautious interest. The smallest one crept closer, her nose twitching as she caught the scent of Carol's simple human food. "Captain Carol," Hector said, his voice carrying a warning that could have frozen helium, "you are interfering with established feeding protocols." Carol looked up at him, still chewing her nutrition bar with deliberate calm. "Ambassador, your established protocols aren't working. Sometimes you have to try something different." And that's when she saw it, the flicker in Hector's eyes that suggested maybe, just maybe, a part of him was beginning to wonder if the human might have a point. But pride is a powerful thing, especially when it's been refined by centuries of cultural evolution and diplomatic tradition. Hector's mane bristled with renewed authority. "The Velani do not require assistance in caring for our young," he stated with the kind of finality that usually ended conversations and occasionally started wars. Carol nodded thoughtfully, took another bite of her nutrition bar and said, "Of course not. I'm just sitting here eating my lunch. What you do with your cubs is entirely up to you." It was a master class in reverse psychology that would have made child psychologists throughout the galaxy weep with professional admiration. By removing herself as a threat to Velthani pride, while continuing to model the behavior she knew the cubs needed, Carol had just given Hector the space to save face, while his children got the help they desperately needed. The smallest cub took another step closer, her fur now cycling through shades of gold that suggested growing curiosity and, just maybe, the first hint of trust. Now, if you've ever been in a room where a small child was about to make a decision that would either solve everyone's problems or create entirely new ones, you'll understand the peculiar quality of silence that settled over Conference Room Alpha 9. It was the kind of quiet that felt like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether diplomacy would triumph or whether they'd all be explaining to their respective governments how a trade agreement worth billions had been derailed by 3 furry toddlers with trust issues. The smallest cub, let's call her the brave one because she was clearly the leader of this particular rebellion, took another cautious step toward Carol. Her fur had settled into a soft gold with threads of curious green, and her oversized eyes held the kind of intense focus that children get when they're trying to solve a puzzle that adults have made unnecessarily complicated. Carol continued eating her nutrition bar with the studied casualness of someone who'd learned that the more you wanted a scared child to approach, the less eager you had to appear. It was an art form that required the patience of a saint and the acting skills of someone who could convince a room full of aliens that sitting on the floor eating lunch was the most natural thing in the galaxy. The protein matrix in that sustenance, Hector observed with the tone of someone trying to maintain dignity while watching his carefully orchestrated cultural exchange dissolve into chaos, is insufficient for Velthani nutritional requirements. You're absolutely right, Carol agreed, taking another bite. It's human food, designed for human physiology. Probably wouldn't do much good for your cubs at all. She paused, as if struck by a sudden thought. Although, when I worked in pediatrics, we sometimes found that scared kids would start eating again if they saw someone else eating first. Something about social modeling, making eating feel safe again. The brave cub was now close enough that Carol could see the individual threads of color shifting through her fur, like aurora patterns across a living sky. The cub's nose twitched as she processed the scent of Carol's food. Not with hunger, but with the kind of analytical interest that suggested she was filing away important information about this strange human who sat on floors and ate simple food without ceremony. Zizak's antennae twitched with what might have been understanding. Social feeding patterns are common among pack species. The observation of successful consumption by a trusted individual can trigger appetite responses in juveniles. Exactly, Carol said, warming to the theme. Except it only works if the juveniles trust the individual doing the eating. The implications of that statement hung in the air like a diplomatic hand grenade with the pin pulled, because if trust was the key, if the cubs needed to feel genuinely safe with someone before they'd eat, then all the pheromone manipulation and harmonic resonance in the galaxy wouldn't help if the children didn't fundamentally believe that the adults around them could be trusted. Hector's mane rippled with what Carol was beginning to recognize as his version of internal conflict. Pride warred with parental concern. Diplomatic protocol battled with the increasingly obvious reality that his cubs were in distress. The cubs, he said carefully, have been provided with every comfort consistent with Velthani child-rearing practices. I'm sure they have, Carol said gently, but they're not home, are they? They're in a strange place, surrounded by strange smells and strange people, and no matter how perfect their accommodations are, Everything feels wrong. She looked up at Hector, and for a moment, the ambassador saw her not as a diplomatic colleague, but as someone who understood what it meant to care for frightened children. Sometimes, Carol continued, comfort isn't about having the best of everything. Sometimes it's about having someone who makes you feel like everything's going to be okay. The brave cub reached out with one small clawed hand and touched Carol's knee. The contact was feather-light, tentative, but it sent a ripple of something through the room that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the universal language of trust being offered and accepted. Carol looked down at the small hand on her knee and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't about diplomacy anymore. This wasn't about trade agreements or interstellar relations or her career prospects. This was about 3 scared kids who needed someone to help them feel safe enough to eat. "Would it be okay," she asked Hector, "if I tried something?" The ambassador's expression suggested he'd rather authorize a small-scale war than watch a human attempt to care for Velani cubs, but the increasingly desperate nature of their situation was beginning to override even diplomatic pride. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. Carol finished her nutrition bar and set the wrapper aside. Then, moving with the slow, deliberate motions of someone who understood that sudden movements could shatter fragile trust, she reached for one of the abandoned Velani nutrition packets. "May I?" she asked, holding up the packet. Hector nodded stiffly. Carol opened the packet carefully, revealing the nutritionally perfect, scientifically optimized food that the cubs had been refusing for 36 hours. It looked like small, jewel-colored cubes that sparkled with embedded vitamins and minerals. Beautiful, efficient, and completely alien to anything the cubs would have associated with comfort or safety. "You know what this needs?" Carol said conversationally, as if she were talking to herself rather than addressing the room full of increasingly anxious diplomats. "A spoon." She produced a simple metal spoon from her jacket pocket. Standard-issue eating utensil, nothing fancy or technologically advanced about it. Just a tool that had been helping humans eat for millennia, worn smooth by countless hands and humble in its absolute practicality. The brave cub's eyes fixed on the spoon with the kind of fascination that suggested she'd never seen anything quite like it. Carol scooped up one of the nutrition cubes and held it out toward the cub, but not in the direct, demanding way that adults usually offered food to reluctant children. Instead, she held the spoon at a distance that required the cub to choose to approach, to actively participate in the feeding process, rather than having nutrition forced upon her. "It's okay," Carol said softly. "You don't have to eat it. I'm just offering." The brave cub studied the spoon, the food, and Carol's face with the kind of intense evaluation that would have made seasoned negotiators sweat. Her fur shifted through several colors that Carol couldn't interpret, but the general trend seemed to be moving away from the sullen purples of refusal toward something warmer and more curious. Then, with the kind of deliberate courage that children summon when they decide to trust someone, the brave cub leaned forward and delicately took the food from the spoon. She chewed thoughtfully, her expression serious and contemplative. The room held its collective breath as she processed not just the taste, but the entire experience. The gentle offering, the lack of pressure, the simple act of being fed by someone who seemed to understand that eating wasn't just about nutrition. The cub swallowed. Her fur bloomed into a warm golden color that needed no translation across species lines. It was the color of contentment, of safety, of a child who had just remembered that eating could be an act of care rather than an obligation. Then she made a sound that stopped every conversation in the room. A low, rumbling purr that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. Impossible, Hector breathed, his mane standing almost vertical with shock. They only purr when they feel completely safe, when they're with their birth parents in their home nest. But the impossible was happening right in front of them. Not only was the brave cub purring, but her siblings had crept closer, drawn by the sound of their leader's contentment. Their fur was shifting toward warmer colors, and their eyes held a new alertness that suggested appetite was finally beginning to stir. Carol scooped another nutrition cube onto her spoon and offered it to the second cub, who approached with less caution than his sister had shown. Soon, all three cubs were gathered around Carol, taking turns with the simple metal spoon, their purring creating a harmonious chorus that seemed to fill the room with warmth. "How?" Hector asked, and for the first time since Carol had met him, the proud ambassador sounded genuinely bewildered. "How did you accomplish what our finest child care specialists could not?" Carol looked up from where she sat, surrounded by purring alien children, her simple metal spoon still in hand, and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd just reminded the galaxy that sometimes the most sophisticated problems had the simplest solutions. "I sat down with them," she said, "and I used a spoon." But even as she spoke, Carol could see that there was more happening here than just successful feeding. The way the cubs responded to her, the depth of their purring, the complete transformation from frightened refugees to contented children. It suggested something that went beyond mere comfort feeding. It suggested that this had been a test all along. And somehow, without realizing it, Carol had just passed. The purring continued for exactly 17 minutes and 33 seconds. Not that anyone was counting, except for the various diplomatic recording devices that were dutifully cataloging what would later be called the most expensive lunch in galactic history. When it finally faded, it left behind a silence that felt entirely different from the tense quiet that had dominated the room for the past 36 hours. This was the silence of a problem solved, of crisis averted, of three small alien children who had finally remembered that the universe could be a safe place. Carol remained seated on the floor, the cubs arranged around her in a loose circle that would have made any pediatric psychologist weep with professional joy. The smallest one, the brave leader of this particular revolution, had actually fallen asleep with her head resting against Carol's knee, her fur now a soft, steady gold that spoke of deep contentment. "Well," said Commander Webb, his voice carrying the distinct tone of a man who wasn't entirely sure whether he should be relieved or terrified, "I suppose we should contact the Velani homeworld and report that the crisis has been resolved." "Indeed," Hector rumbled, though something in his expression suggested that the ambassador was wrestling with thoughts considerably more complex than simple relief. "The cubs are fed. The immediate diplomatic emergency has passed." But Carol, who had spent enough time around children to recognize when something was not quite what it seemed, found herself studying the sleeping cub's peaceful face with growing suspicion. Because here's the thing about children. Regardless of species, they were rarely as simple as adults like to believe. And the more she thought about the past 36 hours, the more certain she became that she'd been missing something important. "Ambassador," she said carefully, "may I ask you something about Velani child development?" Hector's mane rippled with what might have been wariness. "What would you like to know? How intelligent are cubs at this age? I mean, compared to adult Velani? Cubs possess approximately 85% of adult cognitive capacity, by the age these three have reached," Hector replied, clearly puzzled by the direction of Carol's questioning. "They are quite capable of complex reasoning, though they lack emotional regulation and impulse control." Carol nodded thoughtfully, her suspicion crystallizing into something approaching certainty. So they would understand the importance of this diplomatic meeting. They would know that their behavior could affect relations between our species. Of course, Velani cubs are educated from birth about their responsibilities to the greater pack structure. "Then why?" Carol asked, her voice taking on the deceptively mild tone of someone who was about to drop a diplomatic bombshell. Would three intelligent, well-educated cubs suddenly refuse to eat the moment they arrived at a crucial diplomatic summit? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either brilliant revelations or spectacular explosions. In this case, it was the silence of a room full of highly intelligent beings, suddenly realizing they'd been outmaneuvered by three alien toddlers with a sophisticated understanding of interspecies psychology. Hector's mane underwent a series of color changes that would have been fascinating to study under less diplomatically volatile circumstances. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been paternal pride mixed with professional mortification. "You believe," he said carefully, "that the cubs were testing you?" "I think," Carol said, gently stroking the sleeping cub's fur, "that your children are considerably more sophisticated than anyone in this room gave them credit for. I think they understood exactly what was at stake in these negotiations, and they decided to conduct their own evaluation of potential allies." She looked up at Hector with the expression of someone who had just figured out a puzzle that everyone else was still trying to understand. "Tell me, Ambassador, in Velani culture, what does it mean when a cub purrs for someone outside their immediate family?" Hector's expression underwent a transformation that would have been comical if the implications weren't so staggering. "It means," he said slowly, "that they have accepted that individual as pack-worthy, as someone worthy of trust and protection." "And how often do Velani cubs make that determination about members of other species?" "Never," Hector whispered. "In all our recorded history, cubs have never purred for aliens. We assumed it was biologically impossible." Carol felt the sleeping cub shift against her knee, and she could have sworn she detected the faintest hint of smugness in the child's relaxed posture. The little manipulator had known exactly what she was doing. "So," Carol said, "when these cubs purr for a human, when they demonstrate acceptance of humanity as pack-worthy, what does that mean for our species standing in Velani society?" The transformation in Hector's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The ambassador, who had spent the past day wrestling with wounded pride and cultural superiority, suddenly straightened with the bearing of someone who had just received news that changed everything. "It means," he said, his voice carrying a reverence that bordered on awe, "that humanity has been judged worthy of the highest honor our species can bestow. It means that cubs, our most precious and perceptive members, have declared humans to be allies worthy of protection, cooperation, and trust." Commander Webb made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "So you're telling me that this entire crisis was actually an alien aptitude test?" "More than that," Hector said, his gaze fixed on Carol with something approaching wonder. "It was a test that most species fail. The cubs have been brought to diplomatic gatherings before, as cultural ambassadors. They have met with Zephyrians, Luminar, Cortillians, even the evolved gas clouds of the Nebula Collective." He paused, his mane now displaying colors that Carol couldn't interpret, but that seemed to carry deep significance. They have never purred for anyone, until today. Carol looked down at the three cubs, now all sleeping peacefully around her, their fur displaying the soft, synchronized patterns that spoke of complete contentment. So, what happens now? Now, Hector said, everything changes. And he wasn't exaggerating. Within hours, word had spread through the Velani delegation and beyond. The cubs had made their judgment, and in Velani society, the wisdom of cubs was considered sacred. They were believed to possess an instinctive ability to recognize the true character of potential allies, an ability that had guided Velani diplomatic relations for millennia. The trade agreement that had brought them all together was suddenly the least important item on the agenda. What mattered now was the alliance that the cubs had just forged through their acceptance of Carol and, by extension, humanity itself. The Velani Confederation, Hector announced to the hastily convened emergency session, wishes to propose a military alliance with the human coalition. Our cubs have spoken, and we would be honored to stand with a species they have deemed worthy of trust. It was, by any measure, the most successful diplomatic outcome in human history, achieved through the simple act of sitting on the floor with a spoon and treating scared children with kindness. But the universe, as Carol was about to discover, had a sense of humor about these things. 3 months later, she found herself aboard a Velani diplomatic vessel, traveling to their homeworld as the newly appointed human Velani cultural liaison, a position that had been created specifically for her, and that came with a salary that made her former nursing wages look like pocket change. It also came with 3 small, furry shadows who had apparently decided that she was their permanent human. They refuse to eat unless you're present, Hector explained with the long-suffering tone of someone who had discovered that cosmic significance was all well and good, but it didn't make daily life any less complicated. They've declared you their adopted pack leader, and Velani cubs are persistent about these things. Carol looked at the 3 cubs, who were sitting in a neat row, their fur cycling through colors that she'd learned to recognize as anticipation mixed with mild impatience. On the table before them sat their breakfast, untouched and growing cold, while they waited for their human to arrive with her simple metal spoon. "So, let me understand this," Carol said, settling into what had become her permanent position on the floor beside their dining area. "I've gone from feeding human children in a hospital to feeding alien children in space. And somehow, this is considered a promotion." The brave cub, whose name, she'd learned, was Lixana, though she continued to think of her as the brave one, chirped with what Carol had come to recognize as amusement. The sound was remarkably similar to laughter, and it never failed to make Carol smile. "The cubs," Hector said, with the dignity of someone trying to maintain ambassadorial authority while watching his most important cultural ambassadors reduced to giggling children, "find your protests amusing." "Of course they do," Carol muttered, producing her spoon, the same simple metal utensil that had inadvertently changed the course of galactic history, and beginning the morning ritual of feeding 3 aliens who could perfectly well feed themselves, but preferred the comfort of having their adopted human do it for them. As she watched the cubs happily accepting their breakfast, their contented purring filling the room with warmth, Carol reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She'd become a nurse because she wanted to help children. She'd become a diplomat because she wanted to see the universe. She'd never imagined that those 2 career paths would converge in a way that made her the most important human in Velani space. But as Lixana nuzzled against her arm with the trust that only children could give, Carol realized that maybe the universe had a better plan than any she could have imagined. After all, Someone had to make sure the galaxy's newest alliance was properly fed. And apparently, that someone was her. With a spoon. The cubs purred their agreement, and somewhere in the vast expanse of space, the future stretched out before them like a promise written in starlight and sealed with the simple act of caring for children who needed someone to help them feel safe enough to eat. It was, Carol thought, as she spooned another bite of breakfast toward an eagerly waiting Lixana, probably the most important job in the galaxy, and definitely the strangest.